Hey everybody and welcome back. My name is Mel and this video is a bit ambitious. I have decided that I'm going to be reading the first chapter of all of the fantasy books, unread fantasy books on my TBR. This is going to be just obviously fantasy books that I haven't read, and then it is also going to be just the first chapters of either first in the series or standalones. I'm not going to be reading first in the chapter of books that I am on the sequels of because I already know about them. I already know that I'm interested in them. This is more for those books that I've had sitting on my shelves for forever, or maybe they even are new additions, and I just don't know what to prioritize because I've got so much on my shelves, and some books I know are going to surprise me, and some are going to surprise me in not a good way. I actually saw Kayla from Books and Lala do this, and it was a really cool idea. She seems to have referenced it a lot since then, and I thought with Battleathon coming up, it was just going to be a really good way to try to see if I had some new 5-star predictions that maybe I wasn't aware were going to be 5-star predictions, or just to give me a solid stack of books to choose from. So this is going to be a very long video. Buckle up, grab your popcorn, because I think we have over 50 books. I don't know at the time of filming this exactly how many there are. I think there's somewhere between 50 and 70 books. So we have a lot. I hope you're ready. I did not read all of these in one day, so it is going to be a little bit vlog style, but I guess without further ado, let's just jump into the first set of chapters. Hello friends, I have read the first 3 chapters of my unread fantasy books. I'm not really going in any order for these. I'm just kind of grabbing things as they catch my attention. So the first one that I decided to read was The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. This chapter was 15 pages long, and I think it did a really good job setting things up. I think I'm going to give it an 8 or an 8.5 out of 10. I was really intrigued by this first chapter. It is involving this festival that is going on for the emperor, and there are some young boys that have like stolen away from their training academy in order to be there, but someone tries to kill the emperor in the process. And I really liked this setup. I thought that it was really interesting. And I liked the boys' perspectives and them kind of freaking out but acting like teenage boys mixed with the things blowing up at the same time. I thought that that was really interesting. I will say that the reason this probably wasn't a 10 out of 10 is because I am going to struggle, I think, a little bit with the writing in this. When we're in the dialogue part of things, everything's good, but when we're in more of the exposition, it is very wordy. I mean, we're talking sentences with semicolon after semicolon after semicolon that just continue to go and go and go. And I knew that that was potentially going to be an issue with this book, so I may end up doing this audibly just because I don't think that will be as noticeable in an audiobook format, but I was really interested in this first chapter, and I'm excited to continue reading it. Then I decided to pick up A Shadow in the Summer by Daniel Abraham. This one had a prologue as the first chapter, and it was about 20 pages long, so it was a really long prologue. Both this book and the next one both did that, where they had really long prologues. And I think that I'm going to give this one like a 4.5 or 5 out of 10. I was not super intrigued by this. It's not that the writing or anything was bad, it just wasn't really holding my attention. This is a school setting where we start off with Ota, who is in the school, and then as we progress along, the leader of the school asks him if he wants to take up the black cloak and teach other students. And it is a very, and I think I like that setup. Normally I love a school setting, but I was just a little bit bored. I felt like it was being very repetitive and there wasn't a lot going on. This prologue did not need to be 20 some odd pages. I think that it would have done well in a much shorter setting. I think it was just kind of setting the stage, but at the same time I was a little bit confused and I didn't really feel like I was getting a lot of information. We talk about like the aunt, I think is what they're called. Yeah, the Andot. And there are snippets of that, but it's much more focused on like the school part of things. And I'm like, okay, but I want to know more about the world and setting up these poets and just learn more about that. And I don't feel like I got much of that, or at least not as much as I wanted to. So while this wasn't bad, it's not going to be like super high up on my priorities list. And the last one that I read for tonight is going to be Sons of Darkness by Gaurav Mahatme. This one is a new fantasy book that I've been hearing a lot about. It's supposed to be like a cross of Game of Thrones and what else did it say it was mixed with? I don't remember. But this first chapter was also a prologue that was about 23 pages long. And normally, like, if you do a good prologue in a fantasy, you can hook me right off the bat. But sometimes prologues have a tendency to not really do what I think they aim to do. That definitely was the case in this one. But The Sons of Darkness, I think, did do it a little bit better. I probably will give this one like a 7 out of 10. I am intrigued, but I wish that the intrigue had come a little bit sooner. I think that I'm really going to like the sarcasm in this book because it's not really trying to be funny, but it's sarcastically witty in a way that is funny. It's also, I think, going to be quite dark from what I've read so far, and I like that as well. This seems like it's going to be a fantasy sci-fi because in this in the prologue, we have got two characters, a brother and sister, that have come from their world into the world of the Devas to help them win a war. And then they were supposed to go back to their world. But in this Deva world, the mortals have overthrown the Deva is kind of what I was getting. This first prologue is a little bit confusing. I felt like the world building could have been a little bit more clear. You're kind of just dumped in and all of these terms start getting thrown at you, but there's no explanation to any of it, which is fine. I think that you're going to learn that as you go, but just reading only the prologue, it was a little bit jarring. I think if I had continued on, things would have started to become more clear. This one does have like a table of contents in it, so I definitely think that it's going to be an interesting way of telling a story. So I'm curious to see how it continues, and I am excited to get to this one soon. Alrighty guys, so since we last talked, I have actually read 6 more books that I wanted to talk to you guys about the first chapter of. Some of these I really liked and others not super favorites. These again are not in any particular order. Okay, so first up, let's talk about Jasad Heir by Sarah Hashim. This one I think I'm gonna give a 7.5 out of 10. We're in a world where this girl has a lot of secrets and nobody really knows who she is. We know that she is a Jasad or a Jaseed that has magic but has no access to her magic, and people are forbidden from using their magic in this world. And I really liked this first chapter. It is a first-person point of view, and I think it's going to read like a new adult fantasy, which I'm very interested in. I liked the world building. I thought it was good. Writing style was good. Then I read the first chapter of Combat Codes by Alexander Darwin. This is a military fight arena school setting type story. I think it's sci-fi fantasy, and I liked this first chapter. I don't feel like it gave me a lot until more like the end of the chapter, but that's where we were introduced to what I believe will be one of the leading characters and had a really interesting scene with him. And so I think that this one's also going to get a 7.58 because I liked the setup, but I just wish I had been a little bit more like hooked in that very first chapter. But definitely toward the end of the chapter, I was getting more and more engaged. I like the writing style. I think that this one is going to be a lot of fun. Then I read the prologue section of The Wolf by Leo Carew. I have been doing prologues as first chapters for this video because I feel like prologues in fantasy books are really important and they're something that you need to read. So for me, the prologue is the first chapter. This one was only about 6 pages long, but it did intrigue me quite a lot. I think this is probably going to be about an 8 on the intrigue scale for me. I definitely want to know more about what's going on. We open with a warrior who has given the king a tonic to sleep, and he's speaking with the queen about how they finally convinced him to go to war. And then she's like, yeah, anyone would do anything for me. And you can tell she's going to be like the puppeteer controlling the strings behind the king. And there were discussions about plagues and like omens and things like that. I just thought that it was a really cool setup, and I'm very interested to continue reading this one. Then we had the first chapter of The Angel of Crows by Catherine Addison. This one was only about 7 pages long, and it did not really grip me very much. I think I'm going to give it like a 5-ish. I mean, it's fine. It is set in 1887, and we're going to be following a doctor. There is mention of like demons and stuff in here, but I just did not get a very good sample of what to expect from this book in the first chapter. I wish it had been a little bit longer. I wish it had hooked me a little bit better at the end. Then we have my 2 personal favorites from this batch, and I loved the first sentences of both of these. I thought that the sentences were great, and they were definitely a good hook. The first one is We Ride the Storm by Devin Madsen. This one was gifted to me by Maria, so thank you so much for giving this one to me, Maria. I think this is going to be an 8.5 on the intrigue scale for me. I did really enjoy this first chapter. I thought that it definitely gripped my attention and I wanted to know more. We're following twins and we're trying to figure out which one of them is going to be named heir to the empire, but the emperor has apparently been trying to kill them both since they were very young. We don't know why. We don't really know. I don't think that they're related to the emperor, at least they're not his direct children. There was a lot of questioning in this and a lot of like what the heck is going on. You're definitely just dropped in and kind of expected to figure it out. But I think that it's going to be a really, really cool world. This one did throw me off just a little bit being in first person. I don't really know why, because the other one that I read was also in first person and it did not bother me. Not really sure why, but this one did throw me off just a little bit being in first person, but I liked it. I just wanted to read you the first sentence of this because I thought that it was really good. It says, "They tried to kill me 4 times before I could walk." And then just the second sentence too. 7 before I held any memory of the world. Every time thereafter I knew fear, but it was anger that chipped the sharp edges into my soul. So that first paragraph I really was intrigued by, and then the rest of the chapter I just also thought was really well done. And then the last of the batch for today is going to be The Will of the Many by James Islington or Islington. This one is one that I was not really expecting to like. I bought it just on a whim because it was 20% off at Barnes & Noble one day. And since I have picked it up, people have been raving about this book. People that loved the Lycanias trilogy and people that did not are really enjoying this, and so I was happy that I went ahead and grabbed it. This one was also around 15 pages for the first chapter, and I thought that it did a really good job setting up the story and getting me very intrigued. We know that there is Will, and we know that there is a hierarchy here. We're following Vis, who is an orphan, but you get the sense that there's more to him than meets the eye, and we are taking one of the higher members down into these prisons where people I think are getting like their will or their life force sucked out of them, and it was just a really cool setup. I thought that it was extremely well done. I was engaged in the writing style, and I'm very, very curious to see where this book goes for sure. I liked the first sentence of this one as well. It says, "I'm dangling, and it's only my father's blood-slicked grip around my wrist that stops me from falling." And then if you continue to kind of go down the paragraph, it says, "Courage," he whispers. He pours heartbreak and hope into the word. He lets go. I just thought that that was a really good setup, and then it just continues to be really interesting from there. I'm actually kind of mad that with both of these, I can't just stop everything I'm doing and pick them both up right now. This one I think is going to get more of a 10 on the intrigue scale, where I think I said 8.5 on this one, but the more I think about it, the more I think maybe it's more like a 9. Hey everybody, so ignore how tired I look right now. It's been a couple of days, it's been a couple of very stressful days, but we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about some more first chapters from fantasy books. So, over the last couple of days, I have read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8 more chapters of books, so let's just talk about those really quickly. One of the first ones that I read was Cold Iron. This one I gave a 6.5 out of 10, and it had a prologue that was 6 pages long. I did not love the writing in this one. I felt like it was a little bit overwritten, and I think that was part of the reason that I ended up giving it a 6.5 instead of a higher intrigue score. But overall, the prologue just wasn't super memorable to me, so I don't know. I liked it, but I didn't love it, so it's kind of going middle of the road on the intrigue for me. Also read A Stone in the Skull by Elizabeth Bear. This one had a much longer first chapter. It was like 20 pages long, and I ended up also giving this one like a 7 out of 10. This one is following the dead man, and that's a profession, not necessarily the name of this guy, and he is on this caravan that is going from I don't know what place to another place. It's kind of left very vague, and they encounter like this worm thing, and that was pretty cool. It was kind of a battle as it was trying to destroy the caravan. I believe this is a winter setting, which also made it a really cool setting. But the Gage has a message that they're trying to get to another king or queen. And so the dead man must make sure that the Gage can survive in order to get the message wherever it needs to go. So that's really what happened mostly in these first 20 pages or so. I know that that doesn't seem like a lot for 20 pages, but a lot of that was taken up with the battle with the worm, which I did find to be pretty interesting. So I think this one's going to get a 7. Then we have Rise of the Mages. This one I gave a 7.5 out of 10, and it just had a prologue. The prologue was about 7 pages long, and I quite liked the prologue. I thought that it was pretty interesting. We had a man that is in a type of prison. I don't know if he was actually in prison or if it was more of like a prison of his own making, but he wants to make new mages, but there is a god or a god of like forgotten magic or something that appears that has been imprisoned, and he basically takes this guy in as a slave and says that we are going to correct things. I was just kind of intrigued by that initial setup. I'm curious to see where it goes. I typically do like gods in stories, so we'll see if I end up loving this one. And then I think I've read the first chapter of this book before. It seemed really familiar, but I went ahead and did it again for this video because it is the first book in a series. But that's The Blade of Faith by David Deglish. And I think I liked this one a little bit more on reread of the first chapter than I did the first time that I read it. I gave it a 7.5 for intrigue this time, and it did have a 12-page first chapter. And it's told from the point of view of Cyrus, who is the prince of this realm, and he's convinced that when the invaders try to come and take over his land, that they're not going to be able to do so because the gods are behind them and their city is really, really strong, but they make it in despite their best efforts. And the invader says that if you will bring me the royal family and kneel them at my feet, I will let everyone else live. I just want the royal family. And so they do so, and they end up killing the king and queen, and Cyrus is ended up taken as a prisoner. And I think that this leads down a really interesting, hopefully, revenge plot. This is definitely a revenge vengeance type book, but I quite liked that first chapter on reread, and I'm hopeful that I end up enjoying the whole thing because I'm very interested in this series. Then we have this bad boy, which is Legacy of Ash by Matthew Ward. This is a chunky book. And I ended up giving this first chapter or prologue about a 6.5 on the intrigue scale. I was intrigued, but I did find myself kind of losing my bearings just a little bit in the beginning. The prologue was about 13 pages, and it is about a woman who has a rebellious mission. She is a mom, and she has 2 kids that she's trying to keep safe as well. They have a battle, and we're introduced to something called the Wayfarers, which I think is like the opposing army or the realm that she's trying to rebel against. And that ends up not going as planned, and the 2 children have to try to escape despite after their mother is killed in a failed rebellion. And I was intrigued by this one. The writing style is a little bit choppy, so it was taking me a little bit of time to get really invested in, but once the prologue got moving, we got a little further in, I kind of got my bearings. I quite enjoyed it. Next up, we have Green Rider by Kristen Britton. Hopefully you guys can see this. I just realized there's a very large glare over here. Does that help? That helps a little bit. This one had a 4-page first chapter, so not very long, and I ended up giving it about a 6.5 out of 10 for intrigue. We're following the gray one, and he's doing something to restore the world to how it was before. That's really all I got out of I don't know that it was a prologue or a first chapter. This one doesn't really have chapter numbers. It just tells you like the chapter name. So I'm assuming it was the first chapter, but that's really all I got out of it. I was intrigued by the writing style. I'm curious to see where things go, especially since I've heard so many good things about this series. But that first little bit did not really give me a lot to go off of. So I feel like a 6.5 is about as much as I can do in this one. Then we had 2 probably of the strongest ones of this batch, and the first one is The Emperor's Blade by Brian Stadley. This one I gave an 8.5 out of 10 for the intrigue, and it only had a 3-page prologue, but I really liked this prologue and kind of the setup that it was giving. We have this man who we know is centuries old, and he and his kind are very resilient. They can live for thousands of years. They're stronger, better, and they've been trying to procreate, but all of their children have come with the rot, which basically means that they start to slowly die. It gets their bowels and their brain and their heart and their intellect, and they're not able to live like whatever this man is once did. And so you have a conversation between him and his daughter, and you realize that he's about to kill her. And she tells him, she's like, "Father, why do you hate me? Why do you hate us, your children?" And he's like, "That's a word you gave, not a word that I gave." And you can tell he's just very detached from the whole situation. And then she's like, "But why don't you love us?" And he was like, "Again, that's a word that you're using, not a word that we use." And I just found that to be really interesting. I'm super curious to learn more about this rot, and I really liked the way that that relationship was portrayed. I just want to know more from that. So I think this is an 8.5. It could be a 9 out of 10 on the intrigue, because even though it was only 3 pages long, unlike the Green Rider, I felt like I really got a lot of insight into a taste of what the story is going to be, I guess. And then I will admit I was a little skeptical about this last one, because as much as I loved the author's previous series that I read from him, I'm not a huge Flintlock fantasy kind of gal, at least based off of the other Flintlock fantasies that I've read, and that is The Thousand Names by Django Wexler. But I was pleasantly surprised by this first chapter. I ended up giving it an 8.5 out of 10, and the prologue was 11 pages. It seemed like a cool magic system here. We're going to have a rebellion, and we've got a guy, Jana? What's the person's name? Jaffa. So we have Jaffa, who is sitting in on a council meeting about this rebellion, and then he moves from the council meeting to an old woman, and there is a young girl that is captured and brought in, and we're just kind of witnessing this whole situation. And the old woman is trying to get information out of her because she's obviously followed Jaffa to the cave that he's gone to, and she won't give them any information. So she calls on this other young boy, this bald boy, and he ends up slashing her from armpit to thigh, bleeds her out, kisses her, licks both of her eyeballs, and then reanimates this corpse so that they can question it. I was like, wait, what? What just happened? So I definitely think that this deserves the 8.59, maybe even higher out of 10, because like, what the heck was that? I don't know, but I'm very, very intrigued to find out for sure. So I think that this has a really promising first start, and I'm hopeful that means that I will really end up enjoying the rest of this book and series. Okay, similar spot to where we've been filming all of these, but I now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 more books to talk to you guys about. So I guess let's just run through these really quickly. The first one is Empire of Exiles by Erin M. Evans. I have heard fantastic things about this from Maria. Might read that, and Rachel. This one though, I did not like the prologue as much as I thought I was going to. It was like a 5. It was a 4-page prologue. It was okay, but it just didn't really grab me. It's in first person present, which really threw me off. I think the whole book is mostly in third person past, so I'm not really sure why this particular one was in a third person present. Sorry, not first person present, third person present. But it was, and it was kind of weird, and I had a little bit of a hard time kind of following what was being set up. But from what I gathered, we have 2 brothers that are very different from one another, and they are talking about a revolution and whose side they're on and what they're going to be doing in regards to this coup. But they are talking like in the past, I think. No, they're talking like in the future, and they're going to be telling you about the things that happened in the past, maybe. I just was a little unclear about the general setup. Maybe I was just really tired when I read this. I don't know. When I decide to pick this up, I will be rereading all of these first chapters again for sure, but liked it, didn't love it. It's not a prologue that's going to make me want to reach for this, but I also know that I had friends that really, really liked it, so that definitely will work in its favor. And then I read the first chapter of The Adamantine Palace. And this one I was not going to give a very high score at all, but the last like 2 sentences, it got me. This one is also a 3-page prologue, so not a whole lot to really grip you, not a lot of time to really grip you. I wasn't really into it. We were talking about this guy, and he was on the back of a dragon, and he was scared about being on the back of the dragon, and he was talking to a queen, and you just assume that the queen is his lover, and then he shoves her off the dragon and says, yeah, that's what your daughter said too. So you get the impression that not only has he killed the daughter, the princess, but then he just shoved the queen off the back of a dragon while flying. So that one got me. I don't know any more than that, but that was a really interesting way to end the prologue. So I am a little bit more interested in that one than I was before. And then we have The Helm of Midnight by Maria Lassiter. You'll know this one from my 5-star prediction video, because there's just something about a serial killer in a fantasy world and a mask that is enchanted by this old like serial killer that just really gripped me. I will say I did like the first chapter. I gave it a 7, and it was 14 pages long, so it had a good amount of setup. There were a lot of ideas going on. We were introduced to the serial killer aspect. We were introduced to the enchanted object and the mask aspect. We're following, I believe it's like these detectives of the world, but then there's also creatures that are involved as well. So there was a lot of ideas in this first chapter, but I quite liked it. I think this is going to be a really good fall read, so I could end up putting this one on some of my fall video ideas. I think I have one that might be perfect for this. And then we have City of Stairs by Robert Jackson Bennett. This one is the same author that wrote Foundry Side, but this is a more like courtroom murder mystery type fantasy. There are also gods involved. This first chapter was 16 pages, and it did feel really long. It was setting up the courtroom style of things. I think I'm going to give this one a 6.5 on Intrigue, just because there's a lot of courtroom talk, and it doesn't really give you a lot of time to get to know who anybody is. So you're having all of these names thrown at you, but confused. You don't know anyone or what their purpose, their role is in the story. So it was a little bit jarring, but I think that I'm going to end up liking this story overall. I will probably do the audiobook for this because I think listening along with a little more, this honestly has a much more dense writing style than I anticipated based off of what I read of Foundry Side. But anyway, I liked it and I will definitely be continuing this one very soon. Then we have The Art of Prophecy by Wesley Chu. This is obviously an Asian-inspired story, and I gave this first chapter a 6 on intrigue. It was 15 pages long, and it was generally okay. It's following a woman who is up in the world, but she's not like the top in control, and there is a duel going on where basically the like prophesized champion is getting to show off his skills essentially, and he is not all he is cracked up to be, and she decides to put him to the test and really like throws him off, and in the process levels herself up in status. And I did like that kind of women in power, even though they're underthought about, I guess is a good way to put that. But overall, like, it just didn't really grab me, but I am still interested to read this one because I've heard mixed things, but mostly positive. And then we have The Dwarves by Marcus Hentz, and this one is one that I've never heard anybody talk about. I randomly saw it at a bookstore one day and decided to grab it. But this first chapter did not really grab me. I'm gonna give this one a 5. It was a 15-page prologue, which should have been ample time to really grip me. But I think that this one's just gonna be way too classic. It is dwarves, it is orcs, it is elves, it is all the classic fantasy creatures in one thing. And this prologue is opening up with one of the dwarves, and they are defending their town, their city, because they hate the elves and the orcs are coming. Sounds awfully familiar to me. I'm assuming it's basically just going to be Lord of the Rings but without hobbits, and I'm just not really interested in that. The writing style was fine, but it definitely did not grab me. I think it's just going to be a little too classic for me. Next up, we have The Book Eaters by Sunny Dean. This one is one that I've had on my shelves for forever. I was really excited about, then I heard some really mixed things, but it is super short, and so I'm still very interested in it. It's about a woman who eats books and her son that should eat books, but instead eats brains. And I figured this was gonna be a little bit more of a literary setup, but this first chapter was actually quite intriguing. I gave it an 8, and it was only 6 pages long, but it was set up like a horror book. She goes to a convenience store to buy herself some booze and to get her son something to eat and to get him like some cream because he apparently has a rash or something or another. And when she gets home, she's like trying to talk herself into getting him food the whole time, and she opens the door to a Viker who she shoves in the room with him, and then you just hear screaming, and that's where it cuts off. And I just thought it was a really good first chapter. Maybe it gets boring after that, but I did really like this first little bit. Next up, we have Her Majesty's Royal Coven by Juno Dawson. This one is one that I got from the Fairy Loot adult box before I decided to cancel my subscription of it. And I liked this one way more than I thought I would. I gave it a 6.5, and it was a 5-page prologue. It is following this coven of witches who are young at the time of the prologue. We know that it will follow them as adults moving forward, but they are like 11 years old at the very beginning of this book, and they're all talking about who's going to marry whom, but then you hear that, you know, they need to be inducted, and some of their family members aren't super excited about that. I don't know, it was a pretty basic setup, but it did really give me fall vibes, and I think this is going to be a super easy read, so I definitely will keep this book. This was one that I was seriously considering unhauling, but after reading the first chapter, I think I will keep it and try it because I was pleased with the first chapter. I gave it, like I said, a 6.5 on intrigue. Hello, it has been a few more hours and I have read a few more first chapters to talk to you guys about. I have a very large stack. So the first one that I want to talk to you guys about is The Knights of Prague by Nicole Jarvis. This is a historical fantasy set in... No, this is a fantasy set in historical Prague. There we go. And I've heard good things about this one. The historical part does scare me a little bit, but I also think that the setting could be really cool. I gave this one a 6.5 on intrigue, and it is about 6 pages long. It did have like a cool vampire creature introduced in here, but other than that, there wasn't really a lot to this first chapter. I think it was just trying to get you used to the fact that this world is a really dangerous place, and that's kind of the whole point of the setup of the first chapter. I liked it. I found it intriguing. Is it something that I'm dying to pick up and read the rest of? Not necessarily, but I do think that I will definitely keep this one and read it in the near future. And then I also read the first chapter of Flames of Mira by Clay Harmon. I've heard some really good things about this one, and I actually really liked this first chapter. I think I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10 on the intrigue scale, and it was only 5 pages long. We are following someone, and you don't really know what his role is, but they go into this guy's house and drag him out of the house and accuse him of being like a revolutionist or trying to stage a coup to the king. And he's like, I didn't do anything. What are you talking about? And they don't even give him a trial. They just drag him out and ask him if he wants to be killed by ash or ice. And then because they're not giving him a trial, the dude's like, well, then I'm going to let my servant guy over here decide whether or not you get to live or die, like whether you're innocent or not, so that it's an impartial, non-court based thing. And come to find out, he's been bound by magic, so he like can't give anything other than a guilty verdict. And I just thought that it was a really cool setup. It does have a really great first line. It says, "Tonight I would put an innocent man to death." And I don't know, I was hooked. I think that this is going to be a really good one, and I'm excited to continue it. Then we have One Dark Window by Rachel Gilling. This is one that I picked up from the bookstore just kind of on a whim, and then I also saw Riley Marie read it and really enjoy it. Sorry about that, I ran out of storage, but I think we were talking about One Dark Window by Rachel Gilling. This one I saw Riley from Riley Marie really enjoy, and I just wanted to pick it up because it sounded really interesting. It's following a world where there is like some kind of illness going on, and the physicians come when someone shows signs of that illness, but it doesn't sound like the physicians are the good guys, and she manages to get away from them, goes into the mist, gets out of the mist, and comes back with some kind of creature that she calls the Nightmare living within her. And as you guys know, that is a trope that I absolutely love in books, but I also get really historical vibes from this as well, so that's something that I don't love in books. So we have a warring, something I really like, and something that I'm not a huge fan of. Kind of comes out to me giving this about a 6.5 on the intrigue scale, because there was more to do with the like historical side than there was the nightmare side, especially in that first chapter, but I am interested. I would definitely give it a try. This first chapter was 16 pages, so it definitely gives you a really good taste as to what the book is going to entail, I would think, so we'll see. Then I also read the first chapter of Herald the Storm by Richard Ford. This one is an epic fantasy. I gave it a 6. It was only 8 pages long. I wouldn't say that it really gripped me, but I do think that it was well written and it intrigued me enough that I would continue. But it honestly was not super memorable as far as first chapters go. The first chapter was about this guy that was set off to do a task, and it sounds like he was supposed to meet up with somebody and kill them, but the assassin of the guy that gave him the task kind of followed him around to make sure that he fulfilled it, and he was like, well, you better not get captured because we would then have to kill you so that you wouldn't give off any secrets. And he leaves the chapter knowing that the assassin's not far behind him. It was okay. Like I said, nothing groundbreaking, but intriguing enough. Then I read the first chapter of Notorious Sorcerer. This one was a 10-page long first chapter, and I gave it a 5 out of 10. Like, it was fine, but there was absolutely nothing about this that really gripped me at all. We have an alchemist. We have a student that has come to help the alchemist with something, and he ends up going to like this dreamscape and getting attacked by an angel as he's trying to steal something. I'm not really sure if this is going to be the type of book for me, just kind of the way that it was written. I'm just not sure that I vibe with it. I think it's a 5. It could end up even being a 4 on the intrigue scale because I just don't really have any desire to go back to this, even though the synopsis sounded interesting to me. I don't know. I'll keep it for a little while longer, but if I never really get the drive to pick it up, I'll just unhaul it. Then I read Soulkeeper by David Deglish. You guys will remember David Deglish from The Bladed Faith. This one had a very different writing style than The Bladed Faith did. It was a lot more formal in tone and almost like a historical formal type writing that I'm not super sure that I liked. It's following Devin, who is a soul keeper, and he was summoned to this town because there is a plague going on, and he is helping put souls to rest, and they were hoping that he could help also cure the plague. And this is a world where there are 3 sisters, which kind of sound like the Fates sisters, and when you die, they can like bring your soul to them immediately, pass on to the afterlife, but they haven't always been doing that, and so they've been having to bury the bodies in hopes that one day the soul will then travel on like it is supposed to. This one was about 16 pages to start with, so a pretty good chunk, and I gave this one like a 5. It was fine. I actually owned this book and the second book, and I was really intrigued because it talks about all of these creatures and stuff like that in the synopsis, and so I was expecting that to be a part of the first chapter in some way. And when you talk about like creatures, I don't really imply a formal writing style, so it was just kind of weird to me. I will see. It could be just a first chapter thing, but it definitely was not what I expected. Then I also read Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. This is one that I've had sitting on my shelves for forever, and I feel like I know a lot of people that absolutely love this book. I have heard that it has a lot of humor in it, which you guys know is not really my favorite thing. We start off with the band kind of getting back together, and they go to get this guy named Clay, and you can tell that it's kind of like a boys club, and they're all chatting, and then all of a sudden somebody rushes in and says that they need his help, and that's where the chapter ends off. It was 6 pages. Honestly, I give it a 4. I just don't know that this is going to be the book for me. It felt like a comedic boys club Dupro fantasy kind of thing, and I know that that has like such a horrible connotation, and I know so many people love this book that I hesitate to even use that term, because I don't mean that in a negative like toward a person that likes this book, but it is a negative for me personally because I just don't typically like that kind of sword and sorcery type fantasy, and I feel like that's what this is going to be, is a sword and sorcery type fantasy, a get the band together type thing, which I just don't really like. So again, I'm going to keep this for a little while longer, but I've had it on my shelves for forever, and if there's not something that encourages me to pick it up soon, I'm not sure that I ever will. And the last one of this stack is All of Us Are Villains by Amanda Foody and Christine Lynn Herman. This is a young adult fantasy, I believe, about warring families in a competition to see who's going to come out on top. I gave this one a 6 out of intrigue. It was about 16 pages long, and I liked the first chapter. We're talking about 2 brothers that are a part of the same family, and you kind of get introduced to the fact that there is this competition between all of these different families and that they're lethal, but you don't really get a whole heck of a lot more than that. So I'm curious to see how this continues to develop. I would be continuing in this one. It gives me kind of like gang vibes, which I'm not sure if that's the intention there or not, but I liked it. I thought it was pretty good. Hello everyone, good morning, and I have a lot of first chapters to talk to you guys about again today. I think there are 15 sitting in this stack, definitely quite a few, so I guess let's just jump into it. The first one that I want to talk to you guys about is The Warded Man by Peter V. Brett. This is the first in the Demon Cycle series, and I liked this one. I was not really expecting to. I don't know what about this series intimidates me, but it definitely does. I mean, it's not short, but at the same time, it's not the longest fantasy book I've ever read. I think I just assumed that it was going to be really dense in its writing style, and it's definitely not. It's very easy to read. This first chapter was like 30 pages long, and I think I'm going to give it like an 8 out of intrigue, and I really don't know why, because there wasn't any particular thing that like super gripped me. I just vibed with the writing style and I enjoyed it. We're following a young boy who's in a village, and this village has now been attacked by demons. You come to find out that they live on the very outskirts. They're only able to have a messenger come to them once every like 6 months from the city, and they cannot go out at night because demons arrive, and they have wards up, but sometimes those wards fail and they lose their loved ones. And that's pretty much what happened in this first chapter. I think it's going to be really interesting. I'm super excited to read it, and I never thought that I was going to say that. Next up, we have The Sword Defiant by Gareth Harnon. Sorry for the shiny cover. This is a Goldsboro edition. I think I'm going to give this one a 6 out of 10. It was about 13 pages, and it was interesting. We're following a older guy who is kind of down in his luck. He's no longer the really badass swordsman that he used to be, and he's in a pub and they're talking about an ogre, so he decides that he is going to go basically tell this ogre to leave so that it doesn't get killed by all of these crazy drunk barmen. But during all of this, we find out that he has a sword called the Spellbreaker, and this sword is sentient. It talks back. It is definitely a sword defiant. And I thought that that was kind of interesting. We assume that he's probably going to either get the band back together. I think the way that it talks about it on the back, we assume that he is going to become this great swordsman once again with this Spellbreaker sword. But I liked the first chapter. It definitely seems very sword and sorcery fantasy, very classic fantasy, but at the same time I was interested by it, so hopefully it will put a good spin on that classic sword and sorcery fantasy style. Next up, we have Dragonfall by R.L. Lamb. This is another Goldsboro edition, and this one is one that I had really high hopes for, but then I've heard some really mixed reviews, and so I was a little bit more leery of this one. I'm going to give this, I think, a 5.5 out of 10, and it's a 10 pages long. And it was a 10-page long first chapter. This is following a dragon who has decided that he is going to become human in order to fulfill a prophecy. That's really all I got out of the first chapter. It is a unique setup, but there was just something about it that I didn't super jive with. It wasn't bad, it just wasn't gripping me either, and it was really confusing for the beginning of it, so that could have been part of it. Then we have A Crown for Cold Silver by Alex Marshall. This is one that I have seen around a lot, and when I found it at Books A Million for like $5, I decided to go ahead and pick this one up. I want to say that it's grimdark, but don't quote me on that. I gave this one like a 4.5 or a 5 out of 10. It definitely did not grip me. It was a 15-page first chapter prologue, and it had a really good first line. The first line says, "It was all going so nicely right up until the massacre." But then after that, it just got a little bit bored. We had a group of people that were going to this mayor's house or this woman's house to try to convince her to become part of the rebellion or get rid of her for part of the rebellion. I don't know. The writing style just was kind of all over the place. It didn't really flow super nicely for me. Maybe that was just me and the fact that I had read so many other first chapters by the time that I got to this one. So I'm definitely willing to try it again, but I just was not linking at all with the writing. Next up, we have No Heart for a Thief by Justin Lloyd Doolin. This is one you guys have heard me talk about. It is a self-published fantasy that I've been so excited to read, and I am happy to report that I gave this one an 8 out of 10 on Intrigue, and it was a 10-page long first chapter prologue. And it's following an older man, or what is perceived to be an older man, and these soldiers that are trying to capture this young woman, and he kind of gets caught in the crossfire. And he basically shows them up and commands their spirits, thieves their spirits, which I'm assuming we'll learn a little bit more about, and is a complete total badass. And I really liked it. There are definitely spirits talked about in here, so I'm curious to see how those are going to play a little bit more into the story. It was extremely well written, and I'm very excited to continue this one. Then we have Thieves of Shadows by B.S.H. Garcia. This is another indie fantasy. Both of these are in SPF B09, by the way, and I liked this first chapter. I think this one's going to get a 6.5 out of 10, and it was about 12 pages long. It was really well written, and it did have a cool summoning scene, but other than that, I was having a little bit of a hard time getting my bearings because we're just kind of tossed in and expected to know who all of these people are, and that did take me a minute to really get a grip on, but I liked the summoning scene, and I think it was summoning more of an angel, but not necessarily a good angel. Thought that was interesting, and I'm very curious to continue on in this one. Another indie is Salt in the Wound by Benjamin Averin. This one I think I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10, and it was a 13-page long prologue. It is a post-apocalyptic, it seems like, world. I don't know if it's a fantasy world. It seems like it would be, but we also had a mention of cars. But things are just not going well, and salt is a coveted resource now. It did have an interesting enough premise, and the writing was also fine. I didn't have any issues with the writing, but there really wasn't a lot to go on. Our main character is looking for a long dead prince, and in his grave they finally find it, and it has bags of salt, which they were very excited about. Again, I don't know why. I'm curious to find out why. And a sword. And one of his comrades was killed, and that's kind of where we ended the first chapter. I liked it well enough. I would definitely continue, but it didn't just really grip me. Next up, we have A Fairy Tale by Stephen King. This one, I think I'm going to give a 6, a 5, a 6, a 5. I'm not really sure. It was 20 pages long. It was very long. And Stephen King is just so freaking wordy. There is no reason why this entire first chapter needed to give me this whole guy's backstory, starting from when he was like 6 until he graduates high school. It just wasn't necessary. We go through as he loses his mother, and then as his father starts to succumb into drinking, and how that really affected his life, but it has nothing to do with the overall story, and that's just such a Stephen King thing. But also, I was mildly interested, so I can't say that it was like a 2 out of 10, but like, why? Why did we have to go through this whole long thing when any other book would have just said, this is what happened, this is how I felt about it, this is where he is now? I don't know. And I still don't think we're done, honestly. I think the first chapter was just the beginning of that tirade, and it may take 50, 80 pages before we actually get to the plot of the story, which I think is supposed to be fantasy portal worlds, which, interesting, but I don't know. It was alright, but it definitely is very Stephen King. Then we have a young adult fantasy. This is Defy the Night by Bridget Kimmerer. This is a first in a new series. She's the one that did the Her So Dark and Lonely series. This was fine. I think I'm going to give it a 5. It was 8 pages long. It reads extremely young adult, and I don't mind young adult, but I do want it to, I don't know. I'm okay with the angst and stuff that comes with young adult, but this just reads young, like not young adult as in 17, 18, 19, but young adult as in like 15. Kind of young adult. So I did struggle with that a little bit. It was fine. It's about a girl who is trying to gather things for healing because the world has been overtaken and they don't have enough like healing stuff. She is a thief. She is part of the underground. That's really all I got. There's going to be a romance. Sorry if there's a little bit of an angle change, my camera battery died. Okay, next up we have Masters of Death by Olivia Blake. I really liked this first chapter. When I read Atlas 6, it was pretty good. When I read Atlas Paradox, I didn't like it a bit, but I really liked this first chapter. It was only 2 pages long, but I gave it an 8 out of 10. We are following a guy that's delivering something or talking to someone about something, but come to find out he is trapped and people start dying. That's all that I got out of those first 2 pages, but I was very intrigued, liked the writing. I will absolutely be continuing this one very soon. Next up we have The Sun in the Void by Gabriela Romero Lacruz. This one, I think I'm going to like. It is a very chunky fantasy. It's a beautiful Illumicrate edition. And I gave this one a 7, and it was about 10 pages long. It's following a woman who has gotten a summons from her grandmother, and she decides to travel across this icy terrain in order to try to reach her. The grandmother is part of a different culture and is nomadic, I think, and she ends up getting attacked by a creature and saved by another human-like creature but with antlers, and her grandmother is going to save her because she's the only one that can when she is severely injured. That's all I've gotten out of this so far. I was intrigued by it. I normally am not a huge fan of that kind of fairy tale-like story, but it worked for me in this one for some reason, so I'll definitely be continuing. I'm excited to read this. Next up we have Judas Blossom by Stephen Aran. This one I gave a 6 out of 10 and it was 10 pages long. It was pretty good. This is definitely going to be Persian inspired. I think it is historical Persia. And it did have a cool different culture, but it was not overly engaging for me, honestly. I read this last night and I could not really tell you what the first chapter was about, other than it had 2 brothers. One was the Great Emperor and one was the Great Khan, and the brother ends up dying. That's all I remember out of this, so maybe it was more like a 5 out of 10 because it was mediocre, it was fine. Will I still pick this book up? Yes, I'm not going to unhaul it, but it definitely is not on the top of my priority list. Then we have A Daughter of the Beast by E.C. Greaves. This is another indie fantasy that is in SPFBO this year. I gave this one a 6 out of 10 and it is 8 pages long. We do have a child, but it was a very interesting concept, kind of Nona-like child, and there is a beast, and I was just kind of intrigued by it. I wonder if there's going to be music in here, and I'm curious to see how everything shapes up. I will absolutely be continuing this one. Then we had Origin Curse by Sarah Kate Ishii. This one I gave a 6 out of 10 and it was only a 2-page long prologue. We are kind of setting the scene for this world and talking about a curse that has impacted the world. That's really all that goes on in the first couple of pages, but I was very curious about the curse. I think it was well written. I will continue based off of this setup. And the last one that I have to talk to you guys today is The Return of the Kings by Gregory Kontaxis. Sorry, Gregory, if I'm completely screwing up that last name. I gave this one a 6 out of 10. It was only 3 pages long. It did have really good writing and a decent setup, but I do think this is going to be a little bit more classic fantasy. Obviously got sword on the cover, but I will continue this one for sure. I also think this is an SPFBO 9. I went on a binge of buying SPFBO 9 books a few months ago, but yeah, I liked it. I will be continuing. A new day, more chapters. I feel like these chapters are never ending. I own a lot of books that I have not read, and this really should teach me not to do that. But I am having a good time. So I guess let's just start off with 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City by KJ Parker. I picked this one up after reading his short story in the Book of Swords, and I really liked that short story. The writing I was not sure about, but I liked the way that it ended, and so I wanted to pick up a full-length novel of his. This particular one I ended up giving a 6 on the intrigue. It was about 8 pages long. I'm not sure if it's going to be the writing style for me. There is a decent amount of, not humor, but you can tell the main character is trying really hard to be a certain way, and I'm not sure if I'm fully going to appreciate that style of writing. It's definitely going to be a very, very, very in the main character's head. Like, if you don't like him, you're up a creek without a boat, and I don't know how I'm gonna feel about him. I definitely will try this one. I'm not gonna unhaul it, but I am a little less sure about it than I was before. It's just a really wordy. There are a lot of parentheses, there are a lot of commas and like compound sentences, and it just doesn't flow super well in my opinion. But I think that being in his head and kind of that non-linear style is what a lot of people love about this. It's not really doing a whole lot in the first chapter. You know that he is going to buy rope, and you know that he is like a courier, and someone tries to kill him, and that's all you got in the first chapter, but it's, again, very much so being in his head. So I don't know, maybe. And then I read the 4 pages of Dragonflight. This one doesn't really have true chapters, so I just read to like the next heading part, and like I said, it was about 4 pages. I gave this one like a 4.5 or 5. It really did not grip me at all. I can't really tell you what all was going on. It's just so wordy. This is a classic-ish fantasy, and it reads like one. I think that I'm going to have a little bit of a hard time getting into this just because the writing it feels overwritten to me, which was very popular that kind of like when this type of story was being told, but I think I'm going to struggle with it. I really want to love it, and I want to read this classic that has inspired so many things, but I think I'm going to need the audiobook for sure for this one because it's just, again, constant commas and overuse of words that just doesn't really need to be there. So I don't know, we'll see. I'm definitely going to keep this one, again, kind of the way I feel about 16 Ways. I will keep this one, I will try it, but I think I need the audiobook for it. Next up, I read Elric of Melniboné by Michael Moorcock. This is another very classic fantasy. I don't know what possessed me to pick this up. Like, this book is heavy and the pages are Bible pages. That's the kind of book that this is. And I know that it is another like classic fantasy. I don't really know what it's about. I don't know why I bought this, but I think it's just one of those that I do want to try some of those books that inspired other things that I love, but at the same time, it's a little bit of the problem of, well, I've read that before kind of situation. But anyway, this one is following Elric, who is the emperor, and I didn't really follow a lot else of what was going on in this first chapter. This one is fine. I just think that I'm going to need a lot more brain power for it. I gave it a 5 on the intrigue. The first chapter was 8 pages long. I'm just going to need more brain power for this, and it's too late at night. I don't have the capacity for it right now. Now that my air conditioner decided to shut off, we can now talk about Priest of Bones by Brian McClellan. I have had this book forever, and I just have not picked it up yet. This one was about 8 pages long, and I also think I'm going to give it a 5. This was just not my absolute best batch of first chapters. This first chapter just felt like it was trying a little too hard. I think this is going to be a pretty character-driven story, and it's going to be very grimdark, but I like my grimdark to be grimdark. I don't necessarily need it to be grimdark because you're cussing 24/7 and you're talking about raping women. Like, that's not grimdark to me. That is, I don't know. I don't really know how to describe it, but that just doesn't work for me. It just felt like this whole first chapter, when anything came out of any of their mouths, it was just trying way too hard to be something particular, and I don't know how I feel about that. I've heard a lot of good things about this book from people that I do trust, and so I'm hopeful that maybe that was just a setup thing, that's not going to be the way that the whole story is, but it didn't really give me a whole lot in the way of what was going on, what the world was like. It was mostly just these characters and the fact that there was this group of characters and that we have a priest that is in charge of all of them, and they're not great people. That's really all I got out of the first chapter. Again, it was fine, but I'm not in any super big hurry to pick this one up. Next up, we have She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This is a historical fantasy book that has also been on my TBR for literal years. It feels like, anyway, it's not been that long. I've got the Illumicrate edition. But anyway, it feels like it's been on my TBR for forever. And this one was 18 pages long, so it was quite a long first chapter, and I think I'm going to give this one a 6 on intrigue, maybe a 6.5. This is one of those books that the first chapter was all exposition, and I don't know if the whole story is that way or not, but typically when something is all exposition, it doesn't mean that it's written poorly. It just means that I'm going to have a harder time connecting with the characters and the events because it feels very distanced from what's going on, because you're not getting any of the characters' really emotions to things. You're just being told that all of these events are happening. That's how I felt about this first chapter, and I feel like it's one of those books that I'm really going to be able to appreciate what it's saying. I'm going to appreciate what it's doing, but if I can't connect to the character, it's going to be harder for me because of the type of story that it is. So I'm still really hopeful that I would connect with the main character and this would be a really good story for me, but I can see myself struggling with that aspect of it a little bit. But I'm intrigued. Then we have Among Thieves by M.J. Kuhn. This is one that I have been putting off because, like, I thought I would probably like it, but I didn't think I was absolutely going to love it. And I actually think that I'm going to give this one like a 7.5 on Intrigue. I quite liked this first chapter. We have, I think, as an enforcer for a gang member or gang leader or something like that, a lotto guy, and she is going to collect on a debt, and the dude can't pay the debt, and so she chops off his finger, which I find interesting. And you can tell that there's a lot of sneaking around. It's kind of grungy. There was magic discussed, but not a whole lot. So I'm hoping that we will get more of that. I don't know, there's something about the way this was written that I just liked the first chapter of. So I definitely think that I will be continuing here. Then we have The Starless Crown by James Rollins. Again, another one that has been sitting on my TBR for forever, like before I started a channel forever. And this is getting a 9 on Intrigue. It was 4 pages long, and I was very surprised by how much I was engaged with this first 4 pages. It was just a prologue, but we start off with a woman who is literally giving birth on the first page. And it is very, very graphic. So if that's something that you can't do or is a trigger for you, it is very graphic. And we learn that she is a slave, and she actually had her tongue cut out because that was a privilege that she was not afforded. And she goes through this horrible, hard birth and realizes that it's a daughter, and she doesn't want her daughter to be captured and a slave and not a free person just like she was. And so she literally like gets her blade to her throat and is about to slit this baby's throat so that it will never have to go through what she did. And this horrible like serpentine bat looking creature thing comes out of the woods, and I was just like, what the heck is going on? I really liked it. It was a great, interesting prologue. Normally, like, the mom thing doesn't really work for me, but this was in a completely different context, and I'm very intrigued. Like, I will be prioritizing this now, whereas it's been sitting on my shelf for forever. And last but not least, we have The Name of the Wind. This one feels like cheating a little bit because the prologue, and it is literally titled a prologue, was only a page long. 1 page. I think I'm still going to give it a 7. I liked the writing and I liked kind of the flow of it, but it does not give me anything. It talks about 3 silences, and it introduces what I'm assuming is our main character, and it talks about how his is the 3rd silence, but that's literally all you get. And I was tempted to go ahead and read the first chapter anyway because the prologue was so short, but I was like, no. Consistency in the video. We did prologues no matter how long they were. We're going to stick with prologues, but I think I will pick this up. I just keep waiting because I'm like, I don't want to start a series that may never ever be concluded, and I'm not sure that this particular book concludes enough on its own that I would be satisfied just reading The Name of the Wind and not ever continuing on. So if I could potentially be satisfied if it wraps it up enough that I could just read this and be done, let me know down in the comments because I would consider doing that. Okay, so I have my last set of first chapters to talk to you guys about, and this was kind of a mixed bag of first chapters. We definitely had a little bit of everything in here. So the first one I'm going to talk to you guys about is The Black Prism by Brent Weeks. This one I think I'm going to give a 7 out of 10. It was about 10 pages long, and this is a book that I've had on my TBR for forever. I've heard a lot of good things about it, that it has a hard magic system, and it seems like something that I would enjoy. We're following Kip, who is in the woods for some random reason. And he comes up on a guy that has been captured and is talking all crazy and says there's a prophecy about Kip, like the warring side has got him out there to try to lure Kip out. And you find out that there is this spectral type magic, and when people mess with it too much, it can actually turn their irises whatever color they're messing with, and it eventually causes them to go insane. And they believe that Kip has stolen something or has something that they're looking for. I know that that's a pretty vague synopsis, but I actually did like this. I found it to be interesting enough. Like I said, this is a book that I've been putting off for a while, so I'm glad that I did like the first chapter. Wasn't a whole heck of a lot to go off of, but it was enough to definitely keep me interested and wanting to read on further in the book. Then we had A Gallant by V.E. Schwab. This one was 8 pages long, and I think I'm going to give it like a 3 or a 4. I just was not really interested in this first chapter at all. It reads very middle grade, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with it reading middle grade. It's just not the thing that typically is engaging me right now. It's not really what I'm in the mood for right now. And it also reads very gothic, which is another thing that I don't typically love. There wasn't a whole lot to go on this first chapter. We know that Olivia is in a school for girls, and they're basically learning how to like vacuum and mop and It's not really like a true school. It's basically how to be a housewife 101. And she is very depressed here. She doesn't want to be there. She is an orphan. And that kind of is where the first chapter ends. So there really wasn't a whole lot to go on as far as intrigue anyway. And combine that with the atmosphere that's not typically my favorite, I just wasn't overly intrigued. Then we have The City of Last Chances by Adrian Tchaikovsky. And I don't know where to put this one. It was 10 pages long, and I don't know whether this is like a 3 on the intrigue scale or a 7, because basically what the heck is all I've got. This is following a guy that is the last holy man of God, but God literally follows him around and like sits on his shelf and in his porridge and demands blankets. I don't know. It was really kind of weird, honestly. And I don't know whether it was a weird intriguing or a weird just weird. We obviously have a world where things are scarce and people are in hard times. It ends the chapter with the most rich and powerful man in the city being murdered, but that's about it. That's all I got. Writing was fine, but it was a very weird concept, a very strange setup. And so, like I said, I'm not sure whether I'm intrigued or turned off by that, but once I figure it out, I will let you know. Then, of course, we had to do this honker, which is Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. This first chapter was 7 pages long, and I think I'm going to give it a 5. Like, it was generally fine. This woman is supposed to be in seclusion, but decides to go out on the seas and ends up finding an outsider who may have some sort of disease. So she takes him to a doctor to just house him for the night until she can get him to the governor, and there's a dragon. That's pretty much what happens in the first chapter. Again, it was generally fine, but there just wasn't anything that really gripped my attention and made me want to go, yes, let me pick that back up. Even the mention of dragons, because I know that that's not really a prominent part of the story, probably didn't hook me in the way that it could have. Then we have The Pariah by Anthony Ryan. This was a 15-page first chapter, and I think I'm going to give it a 5 as well. Once again, it was generally fine, but it was a lot of exposition, and I just don't know that the writing style and I really got along. We have a guy, he's a part of a band. They are speaking to a messenger and trying to steal something. Again, it's the whole band thing I'm just not really sure that I'm a fan of, and they literally use the word band in here. But I could be persuaded to continue this one. It wasn't bad. It definitely was kind of middle of the road for me, but I would continue. Then we have another Anthony Ryan, and that is The Waking Fire by Anthony Ryan. This one was 8 pages long, and I also think I'm going to give this one a 4 to 5. The very first prologue section that I read was a letter from a guy to a council relaying events that happened and kind of telling them what happened and what they should do about it. And basically this black, which I think is a dragon, got loose and was being really stubborn and wouldn't do what they wanted, and it wreaked havoc on the village. But in the midst of all of this, a woman took her child and literally jumped off of a bridge and killed herself. And it was a little disjointed. I don't really know what's going on, but that definitely set the stage. It reads very historical, and I'm not sure how I feel about that, but I did like the way the prologue was set up. I tend to like that style, but at the same time, like I said, it read very historical and very proper, so I'm not sure if it's really going to be my jam, but I was intrigued enough that I would consider continuing on in this. I also know that there's some people that I know, aka Cassidy, that did not love that book, and so it makes me a little more hesitant to pick it up. And then last but not least, we have The Thousand Doors of Art or Ben. This is by Tyler Whitesides. I have had this book for a little while, but I didn't really know anything about it other than something about dragon poop. And this was a very long first chapter. It was 35 pages, and I think that I'm going to actually give this one a 7 or 7.5. It does a lot of things that should not work at all for me, but for some reason was very compulsory. I felt like I just wanted to continue reading it, even though it was a very long first chapter. We have Ardor, and Ardor is a con artist essentially, and he's trying to sell something called grit to a mobster. And grit, I think, does a lot of different things, but he's trying to sell a grit that explodes, and he goes to trick this guy into believing that this is actual grit when in fact it's fake. And he gets double crossed, and come to find out, him getting double crossed was actually kind of a triple cross, and it's part of his crew, his crew of thieves and con artists. I was intrigued by the setup. I will admit that Ardor may be a little bit too sarcastic humor typically for me. I don't love that kind of main character usually, but at the same time, I can appreciate some good sarcasm. So there was something about this that just worked for me, and I definitely will be continuing. It's a very long book, but like I said, those 35 pages just completely flew by, so I think it'll be a very easy read, and I'm surprised. I didn't think that I would just love this, but I'm intrigued by that first chapter. So that is all of my first chapters. Holy crap, what a journey it has been. I don't recommend doing this over like a week. That is a lot of chapters in a week. If I did my math right, then that was 64 first chapters. And like I said, I only did books that were fantasy that I physically owned and books that were the first in a series or a standalone. I didn't do any sequels. So it is my entire unread fantasy TBR, while also not all at the same time. But I'm just amazed at what I found in this stack, like books that I didn't think that I was going to love, that had really interesting first chapters, books that I thought that I was gonna love, that I really didn't jive with the writing style like I thought that I would. So it's definitely been very eye-opening, and I will absolutely be referencing this in the future when I'm trying to pick my TBR and decide what I want to read. Let me know down in the comments what you thought about this video, if you enjoyed it, and would you want to see me do it again with other genres like horror, thriller, sci-fi, or fantasy romance. I definitely could consider doing it for any of those genres. So if you want to see that, let me know down in the comments below. Also, let me know if you've read any of these books and how my entry you think is going to stack up to what you thought or what I will think about the books. If you literally don't care either way and you were just here for a good time, leave me a teddy bear emoji because I'm literally holding a dog toy right now, trying to get Ollie not to growl and play while we were finishing up this last clip. Once again, thank you all so much for watching and hanging out with me. I know this was a long one, so if you made it to the end, I truly appreciate you. You are the rock star. As always, links to my Patreon, Instagram, Twitter, and Goodreads are all in the description box down below. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you liked it, subscribe if you want to, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!